Great. Apologies for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar today. I'm going to talk about new data on the undocumented AAPI population in California. So when I think about the use of data, it's not just an academic exercise to better understand the size and the characteristics of the undocumented population. I feel that with better data, it can inform our outreach to the communities that we serve. So, for example, immigration legal services, health-related outreach, and we know that Census 2020 is on a lot of people's radars. So with better data on undocumented AAPIs, we essentially can do our work better. So I'm happy to talk about the methods used in the Q&A, but just as a quick technical note, I use the Warren method of imputation. Bob Warren at the Center for Migration Studies in New York developed a method to impute undocumented status using census microdata. So I use an augmented version of the Warren method on the most recent 2016 American Community Survey 5-year file. So we can not only estimate the size of the undocumented AAPI population, but we can also estimate the characteristics of the undocumented AAPI population. And this can inform where to do outreach, to whom to outreach to, and how to conduct that outreach. So with the analysis, what we're seeing is that there are about 433,000 undocumented AAPIs in California. This accounts for 17.4% of the roughly 2.5 million undocumented immigrants who currently live in California. Now, when we think about the data, the first thing that we can do beyond just the total number in California is break down the geographies. So we can go by county, as you see here. I'll show another geographic unit in a following slide. And because a lot of organizations work beyond specific cities and specific counties and in entire regions, I'll show data for Southern California, Northern California, and the Central Valley. But here, what you see is a breakdown of the undocumented AAPI population by county. So as expected, Los Angeles County tops the list with 138,000 undocumented AAPIs, which represents about 32% of the entire undocumented AAPI population in California. And what we see in the table here is that Los Angeles County, Santa Clara County, and Orange County, the top 3 counties on the list, account for over half of all undocumented AAPIs in California. Please do reach out if you have any questions about any other geographies that I do not discuss here. But we know that when we are thinking about doing outreach work, a place like Los Angeles County is huge. And knowing that there are undocumented AAPIs in Los Angeles County doesn't help inform our outreach that much. And so what we can do is break the data further down by public use microdata areas. So PUMAs are census geographies that provide more granularity than counties. So PUMAs are roughly 100,000 person cuts of the entire country. And the PUMAs are supposed to be meaningful to people who live in the areas. So for example, the PUMA with the largest number of undocumented AAPIs is Alameda County, South Central Alameda County in particular, and East Fremont City. So when we think about Alameda County, I don't know the county very well, but similar concern. Counties are big. It may not help to know that there are undocumented AAPIs in Alameda County. But East Fremont City, hopefully for those in Northern California, is a more meaningful geographic breakdown. And second on the list, we see Santa Clara County Northwest and Sunnyvale and North San Jose in particular. And third on the list, for those in Southern California, we see Central Los Angeles County, but the PUMA itself is essentially Koreatown. So as we can see from this table, the breakdown of data at the PUMA level, as soon as we can start unpacking these PUMAs and seeing the specific cities and the specific areas within those cities, then we might be moving the needle a little bit more in terms of more specifically targeting outreach. So what we can also do with data is get a sense of the undocumented AAPI population. So we know roughly 433,000 across the state. We can break numbers down by county levels. We can break the numbers down by PUMA levels. But there are some organizations that work on very specific issues. And so knowing a little bit more about the undocumented immigrants in any particular geography can be helpful for organizations in their work. So here are a few select indicators related to economic integration. Here we see that 92.9% of undocumented AAPIs in California who are in the workforce are currently employed. So this translates into about 250,000 people in California. Now, undocumented AAPIs who are in the workforce and employed make an average of $55,000 per year in pre-tax salary and wage income. So this translates into $14 billion annually. So with these two data points, one can imagine sort of improving outreach to a particular population with respect to employment related issues. But one can also imagine using these data to sort of craft a narrative around the economic contributions of undocumented AAPIs in California, especially that big number of $14 billion annually in pre-tax salary and wage income. So with the census microdata, we can further break down the specific industries and occupations. So for industries and for occupations, this might be of interest for groups working, again, on employment-related issues, labor issues, worker rights issues, etc. So the top 5 industries, and these are using census industry categories for undocumented AAPIs in California, are manufacturing, professional, scientific, and technical services, healthcare and social assistance, accommodation and food services, and retail trade. So industries can be helpful, but industries are not as intuitively understood by the general public as specific occupations are. So the 4th bullet point you see on this slide, we see the top occupations. First, software developers, applications, and system software. So that is also a census occupation categorization. Personal care aides, managers, waiters and waitresses, and cashiers. The occupations are interesting because we have traditionally sort of blue-collar jobs at one end of the workforce, but we also see white-collar jobs on the other end of the workforce spectrum. Again, we can use these data to not just sort of better understand this population, but begin crafting a very different narrative about their economic contributions, not just in dollars and cents terms, but also in terms of their skills in the workforce. So we can sort of achieve similar things in terms of better understanding the characteristics of the undocumented AAPI population to improve outreach, as well as using data to craft a new narrative around undocumented AAPIs in California. With respect to societal integration, we typically think of things like number of years in the United States, English language use, educational attainment as indicators of the societal incorporation of immigrants. And so the first bullet point, what we see is that the undocumented AAPI population has lived in the U.S. for an average of 12 years. So this population is newer than other undocumented populations by race and ethnicity, but on average, undocumented AAPIs have lived in the United States for over a decade. 60.7%, so 6 out of every 10 of California's undocumented AAPI population lives in a mixed status household. So when we think about the first bullet point, we're talking about the deep roots that AAPIs have in the United States. And for the second bullet point, this is illustrative of how these deep roots also attach themselves to not just the sort of undocumented experience in California, but also to an increasingly diverse type of California where families are, documented, undocumented, and all of the above. So 26.1%, the third bullet point, are LEP, so limited English proficient. They do not speak English do not speak only English or speak English very well. So the LEP population, a lot of not just organizations, but also government institutions, focus outreach to LEP populations for a variety of different services. And 26.1%, that's a pretty large number. 52.8% of California's undocumented AAPI population has a bachelor's degree or higher. So this is for those who are 25 or older. That is a tremendously large number, and we'll see shortly how education doesn't necessarily translate into prosperity for undocumented AAPIs. For those who are working on integration of immigrants and newcomers in California schools, we see that over 60,000 undocumented AAPIs are currently attending school. 50.5%, so just over half, are in K through 12 education. And then lastly, 28.3% of California's undocumented AAPI population does not have any health insurance coverage for those that are working on healthcare. So again, we can break down the numbers beyond just the total estimate down to geography, as well as various indicators related to how well undocumented AAPIs are doing on a range of different indicators, or how sort of difficult the integration process may be for some of these specific indicators. Whoops. So now, country of birth. Here we see that California's undocumented AAPI population comes from at least 92 different countries and territories. So we know that the AAPI population in general is diverse. We are not monolithic. We see here that the undocumented AAPI population is similarly diverse. So the top 5 countries of birth for California's undocumented AAPI population are China, including Taiwan and Hong Kong at 23.1%. The Philippines comes in next at 18.7%, followed by India, Korea, and Japan. Now, the table here lists the top 12 countries of birth for the undocumented AAPI population. And I put the top 12 countries because all of these countries have at least 3,000 undocumented AAPIs in California. And what we see are a lot of East Asian countries, as one would expect, some South Asian countries as well. But at the bottom of the list, we also see Canada and Fiji. So when we think about the undocumented AAPI population, it is East Asian, it is Southeast Asian, it is also Pacific Islander, and in some cases, you have AAPIs born in Canada now living in the United States without authorization. Now, here's a little bit more about LEP Outreach. So my main argument that I'm putting forward is really that we can use data to better understand the undocumented AAPI population so as to better outreach to that population for a variety of different services. So on LEP Outreach in particular, we see that 112,000 are limited English proficient. For those who are thinking about language access issues in California schools, there are roughly 3,700 LEP undocumented AAPIs in K through 12 education. But more to the point, here we see that a majority of California's undocumented AAPI population who are LEP live in LA or Orange County. And so if one has an interest in outreaching to the LEP population, one of the first questions might be, where are they? And so LA County and Orange County top the list, but again, LA County and Orange County are very large places. But we can sort of start our inquiry there. And then we just dig a little bit deeper. Among the 42,566 undocumented AAPIs who are LEP in LA County, we see that 45.5% were born in China, 33.8% were born in Korea. When we think about the LEP population and outreach to that population, we need to better understand the groups that we're talking about, because we need to make sure we have language capacity and cultural competence when we engage in that outreach. So that second bullet point is just indicative of knowing the undocumented AAPI population by characteristics such as country of birth, or we can also drill down on specific language. Then helps us do our work better. We know how to staff up and the characteristics of the qualities in the staff that we're looking for, so that we can have authentic interactions and basic conversations with the populations we're outreaching to. So if we're saying, okay, LEP population, and we're saying LA County, and we're saying Chinese and Korean in particular, then that additional step of drilling down to the PUMA level then gives us a sense of where to do that work. And so for LA County at the PUMA level, we're talking about 5,164 in Koreatown, 4,631 in Monterey Park and Rosemead, 4,262 in Arcadia, San Gabriel, and Temple City. So for those familiar with Southern California and LA County in particular, these are meaningful places. These are cities and sometimes neighborhoods that one can basically close their eyes and envision where to do the work that needs to be done. So for LEP outreach, this is one example of taking the overall estimate of the LEP population, trying to figure out where they are in the state, trying to learn a little bit more about who they are in order to inform outreach, and then further drilling down to ultimately implement the work to be done. Now, I also have data on California's regions. So when we think about California, it's a big state. And when we think about the undocumented AAPI population, we know it's diverse. And so that diversity may sort of lead us to think about how AAPIs are doing in different regions of the state. So we can think about Southern California, Northern California, and then the Central Valley. The first table above shows the breakdown of the undocumented AAPI population by California's regions. So we see that 55.4% live in Southern California, 35.3% live in Northern California, and the rest live in the Central Valley. So similar thing in terms of the overall estimates, drilling down to a meaningful geography for work to be done, and then specific indicators, so specific characteristics of the undocumented AAPI population. So the first indicator that you see in the second table is the percent employed. You'll see that it's 92.6% in Southern California, 94.2% in Northern California. CV, the column CV, stands for the Central Valley. That's 89.9% employment. And then statewide employment for all Californians is 91.4%. So what we can do in breaking down California's regions is essentially say, well, how are undocumented AAPIs faring in a particular region in the state compared to undocumented AAPIs in other parts of the state? And how does that compare to all Californians as a whole? So at least on employment, we see that undocumented AAPIs are punching a little bit above their weight in terms of employment in Southern California and Northern California. But in the Central Valley, we see lower employment than the statewide average. Now, the second, third, and fourth rows in that table, this is the percentage of undocumented AAPIs that live at 100% or below the federal poverty line, at 200% or below the federal poverty line, and at 300% or below the federal poverty line. So just a kind of quick punchline, undocumented AAPIs in Northern California are earning more than undocumented AAPIs in other parts of the state, which can be expected. But what we see is that the Central Valley, poverty among undocumented AAPIs is significant, not just compared to other undocumented AAPIs, but significantly higher than these statewide averages. On that fifth row, we see the percentage of undocumented AAPIs with a bachelor's degree or higher, also broken down by the different regions in California. So the quick punchline there is that undocumented AAPIs are significantly more educated as a whole than the statewide average. But a few lines below, I'll show how that doesn't translate into prosperity for all undocumented AAPIs. And lastly, because a lot of groups work on health access, we see that health coverage among undocumented AAPIs varies significantly by region, and we see some major issues when compared to the state as a whole. So right now, I'm at the fifth row in the second table. The row says percent no health coverage. In Southern California, it's 34.3%. So 34.3% of undocumented AAPIs in Southern California do not have any health coverage. And in the Central Valley, it's 37.6%. That's significantly higher for Southern California and the Central Valley when compared to Northern California. So in Northern California, undocumented AAPIs, only 16.4% do not have health insurance. Now we see the far right column, the percentage for all Californians is 12.7%. So that should be of interest for those working on health access. Now, the next set of rows, employed and less than 100% poverty line, employed and less than 200% poverty line, and employed and less than 300% poverty line. This is giving us a sense of the percentage of undocumented AAPIs who are what we would call the working poor. So they have a job, but they're at 100% or below the poverty line, 200% or below the poverty line, etc. So what we see is for the Central Valley, things stick out again, where in terms of the Central Valley, undocumented AAPIs, even if they are employed, are more likely to be in poverty than other undocumented AAPIs across the state. But we also see in the Central Valley, again, the percentages are higher than the statewide average and significantly higher than the statewide average. So just to provide a quick interpretation, 9.8% of undocumented AAPIs in the Central Valley are employed, but still live at 100% or below the federal poverty line. The statewide average is 7.7%. For the Central Valley, 37.7% of those who are employed live at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. That's 14.2% higher than the 23.5% statewide average. And lastly, 58.2% of undocumented AAPIs who are employed live at 300% or below the federal poverty line. And that's nearly 20 points higher than the statewide average. So when we think about employment, that's not necessarily an indicator of doing well and, more generally an indicator of prosperity. And I included data on 100%, 200%, and 300% of the federal poverty line. But because some California-specific programs are based on 266% of the poverty line or other percentages, I just added the 100, 200, 300% here, but these can easily be broken down into the specific percentage cutoffs that indicate eligibility for certain California-based programs. So the next set of rows show BA or higher, so having a bachelor's degree or higher, and still being at 100% or below the federal poverty line. So what we see here in general is that Undocumented AAPIs in Northern California are doing better than undocumented AAPIs in other parts of the state. But here, undocumented AAPIs in Southern California, they're not doing that much better than undocumented AAPIs in the Central Valley in terms of having a bachelor's degree or higher and that education being a pathway to prosperity. So as a quick interpretation, what we see here is that 11.4% of undocumented AAPIs in Southern California who have a bachelor's degree or higher live at or below 100% of the federal poverty line. So that's that's almost twice as high as the statewide average of 5.9%. 23.1% of undocumented AAPIs in Southern California who have a BA or higher live at 200% or below the federal poverty line. And that's nearly 10 points higher than the statewide average. So what we're seeing here is that, as I sort of hinted at earlier, education is not a direct pathway to prosperity for undocumented AAPIs in California. The same way that employment doesn't necessarily imply economic prosperity. In the last set of rows, we see those at or below 100% of the poverty line who have no health care coverage. And that's replicated for the 200% threshold and the 300% threshold. Now, these numbers are pretty stable throughout. So the punchline here is simply that undocumented AAPIs who are poor are more likely than not to not have healthcare coverage. And the furthest most column to the right shows that the statewide percentages range from 19 to 20% across each of these three federal poverty line thresholds. So what we're seeing here is that if we want to improve health access among undocumented AAPIs, we may want to start with those who are at the sort of lowest income thresholds. Now, with these data here, again, the data, I think, are a point of departure for thinking about different outreach strategies for the work that is already being done with respect to improving the lives of undocumented AAPIs in California. And so when we think about something like having a bachelor's degree or higher, but such large percentages continue to live at or below various cuts of the federal poverty line, one can then imagine various programs related to workforce development or professional licensing, where bachelor's degrees from foreign universities weigh more in the California workforce than they currently do. And that might be one way to, help these individuals who have these degrees out of poverty. But that's just one example among many. So when I think about what we can do with these data, it really is about complementing existing outreach strategies. I think that since DACA in 2012 and the effort to outreach to undocumented AAPIs who might be eligible for DACA, I think through that experience, a lot of us learned that the strategy of holding things like DACA workshops or large group processing events, advertising those events through things like ethnic media, did a lot of great work, but it didn't reach the numbers of undocumented AAPIs that we thought that those outreach strategies would. And I think some of you may have, direct experience of, creating one of these events and having them be very successful, but mostly with Hispanic Latino undocumented immigrants who are thinking about DACA rather than AAPI undocumented immigrants who are thinking about DACA. So one of the things that I would invite us all to think about is how we can improve direct outreach to undocumented AAPIs. So when we think about the data that I just presented, it just scratches the surface. Again, the point with the data isn't, the point with this webinar isn't to present an exhaustive set of data points related to undocumented AAPIs. It really is to just provide a sense of what can be done with data, from overall estimates to breaking down characteristics to breaking down geographic units, so that we can improve the work that we're doing on the ground. And so with the data, on the one hand, one can think about direct outreach on the other hand. And direct outreach is very difficult, but one version of this direct outreach that I am working on is to think about direct outreach through a voter engagement lens. So when we think about the ground game for a political campaign, for example, we typically think about things like door-to-door canvassing, phone banking. Now we have text banking. And if you haven't worked on a campaign before, then you may not know that a lot of data are publicly available that informs that work, in particular voter files. Now, this isn't to say that undocumented AAPIs are going to show up in voter files. We know that that's not going to be the case. But if we think about trying to do direct outreach to a particular community, and if we do see, for example, in the data that large numbers of undocumented Koreans are in Koreatown who are LEP, then one can imagine thinking about leveraging new or just a different source of data, for example, a voter file. Because in most enhanced voter files, what we get are names, addresses, phone numbers. That's how we knock on doors. That's how we call people. And then we also get the race and ethnicity of the individual. And one can imagine that large numbers, again, 6 out of every 10 undocumented AAPIs in California are now in mixed status families. And so direct outreach through something like a voter file isn't necessarily going to get you to the undocumented person first, but it may get you to the person who has an undocumented family member in the household. And that way, instead of shooting in the dark and calling all numbers in Koreatown, which can be done but wouldn't be the most effective, you're starting with a smaller universe of phone numbers and basically asking a couple of pre-screening questions before you may get to the person that you want to talk to let them know about various services. And we should remind ourselves here that if you have an opportunity to talk to somebody who may have an undocumented family member or close friend, they may be the best messenger for the services that your organization provides, rather than your organization or your institution trying to talk to the undocumented person him or herself. So here, this is something that I think is very much worth exploring, because again, the contrast is a strategy of if you build it, they will come. We learned through DACA that if you build it, they likely won't come. And so how do we take a very large state and try to sort of narrow down the potential universe of folks to conduct direct outreach with in order to give ourselves a higher likelihood of talking to the people that we want to talk to, in order to educate them about the range of various services your organizations, as well as the state of California provides. Another thing that I would invite folks to think about, and I know some organizations are doing this, but not all organizations, and there are different ways of doing this. But social media targeting, I talked about this a little bit in a previous webinar, but just to reiterate the point here, what we can do with social media targeting is pretty granular, and that is the sort of advertisers' fascination with things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. When we think about the data that I just presented, we can, again, specify a particular geography. We can drill down to the languages spoken by undocumented AAPIs in that geography, and we can further break down characteristics like whether or not they have health insurance, whether or not they're in a public K through 12 school, etc. And What social media does is provide a similar level of granularity in their targeting. So as an example, Facebook ads can easily be done by geography. So one can specify, for example, San Diego. One can specify different age groups depending on the outreach that is to be conducted. One can specify by income levels if it's for some California-based program with income thresholds, and also by language. So as a quick example, in a matter of seconds, one could create a Facebook ad targeting San Diego and specifying either Chinese, simplified Chinese, or traditional Chinese for either Hong Kong or Taiwan. There's additional targeting, for example, expats. So what Facebook and other social media vendors do is ask people for their background. And so if one put that they were born in Hong Kong, like myself, but is currently using Facebook in San Diego, then Facebook knows that I'm an expat. They don't necessarily know whether or not I'm an immigrant. They just know that I was in one place and I'm now in another place. And so one can imagine doing this based on the data that we just saw, where we're essentially saying, where is that LEP population most dense? For example, what cities and areas within Los Angeles County? And what languages do we need to conduct this outreach in? And you can widen the net a little bit by the different or by additional demographic characteristics. And as a quick example and I did this right before the webinar, but in San Diego, I can target all individuals who speak Hindi, who are Indian expats, as well as their families and friends. There are about 3,200 that that's Facebook's estimated audience for these criteria. So if there was something in particular that we wanted to outreach for, and the Asian Indian population was of interest, and in particular the Hindi-speaking Asian Indian population, then in just a matter of seconds, we can specify to that criteria. So I'm not saying that this is going to cure all, because one actually needs hundreds to thousands, if not tens of thousands of impressions. So that's an individual scrolling through and seeing an ad in order to get a significant level of engagement with those ads. So social media targeting is very useful. So combining the data that I previously showed with the social media targeting is a potentially fruitful, different avenue. And again, this is not to supplant existing outreach modalities, just to sort of complement existing outreach modalities. And with just an additional quick note is that this also works with older AAPIs. We see from Pew surveys that an increasing number of non-millennials, so anybody 35 and up, an increasing percentage of non-millennials are on various social media platforms. And there are different social media platforms beyond Facebook, suffice it to say. So when it comes to the sort of general punchline here, this is to say that we can use data to better understand undocumented AAPIs to then inform our outreach to undocumented AAPIs. And existing strategies, I think the work that has been done has been tremendous over the last several years with respect to undocumented AAPIs and immigration-specific issues. But I think we can do better. And in this political climate, I think we absolutely need to do better. And if that takes experimenting with new strategies and failing, I think it's worth the risk, because the stakes at this point are too high not to try. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ju.
Great. Thank you for your presentation. Now we'll open up the Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to write in questions in the chat box. We have one question here. You may have briefly touched upon this, but I'm wondering if you can share if you have any data on what percentage of the community's college degrees were obtained in the U.S. versus country of origin.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I will be the first to say that the census microdata provides a wealth of information. It does not provide all of the answers, though. I don't have the percentage of undocumented AAPIs who graduated from two-year community colleges in California. But what we can do in the census microdata is get the percentage of undocumented AAPIs who are currently attending a two-year college. We can estimate that because we have this variable in the census microdata called grade attending, and beyond 12th grade, there is some distinction between type of institution. So for those who may be interested in undocumented AAPIs who attend a community college and their pathways to higher education after that, we can begin exploring and consistent with the broader message here. I think the data can point the way to figuring out how to do the work that needs to be done.
Thank you. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to write any questions in the box. Another question is, if folks have want to learn more about outreach strategies that you mentioned about, how can they access to it, or how can they learn a little bit more about those outreach strategies?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I will have a new U.S. Immigration Policy Center at UCSD. We should be launching in fall. A lot of the data that I presented here and the more specific drill downs I plan to host at that website. And there will be a few different outreach interventions that we test, and the results will also be posted on that website. So, look in the fall, look out for a new U.S. Immigration Policy Center at UCSD. And the work that I mentioned is going to be part of what I call the Undocumented in America project.
Great, thank you. And we do not have any more questions, so we'll close out the webinar. Thank you to everyone who joined us for today's webinar, and we'll share the recorded webinar's link with you in the upcoming days. Again, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.